start our work session for this evening. So first off, we have a couple of extra new faces at the table. Would you like to introduce yourself, or do you want me to introduce you, or?
I'm Stephen Hoffman. I'm coordinator of the Historic Preservation Program at Southeast Missouri State University. And I'm currently in St. Genevieve doing our annual summer field school in collaboration with the Felix Valley State Historic Site. And Donna asked me if I'd be available to come and sit in tonight. So,
Wonderful.
you're right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Gary Smith, Alderman Liaison.
Thank you also.
Casey, I'd like to be recognized. I'd like to make a statement.
Okay.
I'm going to read this. I'm not an orator. I'm more of a babbler. The older I get, the easier it becomes. I take issue with statements made in our April meeting insinuating we are uninformed. This commission has a city ordinance and guidelines to follow. We read, we study, and we weigh each request as to the compliance with the guidelines while taking into consideration the people who live in these houses. And without people, we would not have a city. I, for one, do not want the historic district to become such a rigid place that no one wants to live or bring a business here. I wish to respond to the statement about training classes. In December of 2018, we were lucky enough to have Dr. Hoffman, who heads the historic preservation at Southeast Missouri State University. The workshop was advertised. Dr. Hoffman gave an excellent talk. Where were the naysayers? We don't always agree on issues. It comes down to a vote. That is how it works. I want to talk about consistency. How can there be consistency with such a wide array of styles? Each house is different. Most fall into the contributing category. The guidelines describes for us examples such as French colonial, where the true landmarks, the styles such as Federal, Greek, Revival, Italianate, Second Empire, Gothic. It's all here in Chapter 2. It goes down the list. Queen Anne, vernacular, etc. Some of these houses do not fit anywhere. In the introductory of the guidelines, it states, quote, "The guidelines are not a rigid set of rules, and they do not require that buildings be restored to a historical period or style," end of quote. Now about setting a precedence. There was a remark, and I quote, I'm going to read from the paper. I don't know if you know it, but 4 years ago the commission denied use of exposed fastener roofing on the Valentine Rottler house in a vote 7-0. They denied it. The Board of Aldermen did overturn that. But is that the precedent now that we can have exposed fastener roofs on any place that had a metal roof or wants to put one on? I don't get it. If the Board of Aldermen overruled the then commission, then it was a bad decision in the first place. Wouldn't that decision set a precedent and not this commission? People live in these houses. I believe the alderman takes this into consideration. Metal roofs have changed over time and evolved, or metal roofs of the 1800s. Now I want to talk about approval of the roof that we did in March. The property is a contributing property. Therefore, we can be more liberal. The guidelines state in kind or replacement material. To me, the existing roof was a metal roof, and we approved a metal replacement. From the street, it's hard to define the exposed fasteners. The roof does not change the structure or style or character of the building. There are other exposed fastener roofs in St. Genevieve, and this commission did not set that precedent. The roof is permanent. It can be replaced. The roof is not permanent. It can be replaced. There are no original roofs in St. Genevieve. Cost was never a factor. One of the commissioners just asked the difference in the cost out of curiosity. Let me get that water. I'm like a camel. One last thing I would like to clarify about a decision made by this commission last year in reference to a door on a landmark property. The property is the first schoolhouse on Washington Street. The request was to install a different front door on the building. We said no. The reason, the way the owner wanted to redo the door would have altered the opening and the character of the building. You can't do that to a landmark. This was explained to the owner. I'm done. I've had my say.
Thank you, Martha. Do you
Yeah.
want to comment or?
I would just say
Make-
real quick that, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
that the commission's had some tough decisions to make recently, as in all years, and has taken some feedback, and a few of you emailed about that feedback that maybe we should discuss it. And so after that, there was a decision made to have a work session in order to discuss not only perhaps those decisions, but also the format and method for making those decisions. So I took the questions that some of you asked and formatted some questions that are just there for you to read, use, or not use. But the majority of it revolved around what are the guidelines? Martha kind of addressed that in her statement. And how should the guidelines be applied? And what method should we use in a meeting to relay that information to the public? I will certainly offer anything you need here, but it is open for you all to discuss those.
I have a lot of ideas, but I don't want to dominate this meeting. So I'm going to hold off and let other people talk. I always got ideas.
Do we want to start with the list of ideas from our emails back and forth with David and kind of work through some of those? Are there any of them that like stand out the most that we need to discuss? Whether it be guidelines, standards of ordinances, procedures, the way we do things. I know one that I was questioning was changing possibly the approval motions and how it's worded. So on number 3 on our list here, it says, should project approval motions specifically cite city ordinance and/or design guidelines? Will changing the verbiage of approval motions make them more or less confusing to the public? I liked the idea of, David had sent us some ideas of stating, we are looking at, say, a roof, and we go back and we say, in our guidelines in section, I don't have it with me, like whatever section it is, number, if it's like H3, this is why we're going this direction. Does anybody else have any opinions on that? Do we think that it's going to make it easier, make it more complicated?
Well, I kind of like that idea, that you go back to the specific ordinance about the specific material and work being done, because that would back up the decisions made by the commission if further down the road there were objections made. It's like, well, no, we went by the ordinance, we went by this specific one, and this is why we approved it or disapproved it. There would be some structure behind the approval or the denial, rather than just, well, we didn't like it, or we thought that was a good idea.
I don't think any of us have ever said we didn't like it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any of us have ever said we didn't like it.
No,
Well,
but
I
it
would
would give
say-
us specific guidelines
agree.
per the book.
I agree, but into the question of confusing the public, do they have the guidelines? Do they have the book?
Is it
So-
available?
Well, then, here you go again.
Anybody wants to
They can
read my
come get it.
guidelines, they can come over, call me
You got-
up and you come over and read whatever you want.
The guidelines are available on the city's website.
Oh, well, that's
Well, good
good.
then.
I don't have to be home then.
My only addition to this, and I don't want to interject much, because I sent you those proposed motions for your consideration, which is up to you. But my concern and my comment, I guess, is every situation is different. Whether it's
True.
contributing or landmark, non-contributing, whether it used to have this or it didn't used to have this. So I will go forward with whatever I'm told to go forward with. But
Well, I-
if we do explain the decision, which is fine, that doesn't mean that it will apply to my house the same as it applies to your house.
Well, I think that that is the whole purpose of the guidelines, is to recognize that every house in the town is not the same. Every owner's desires are not the same. And it tries to spell out what it is we are doing, whether that changes or whether it restores. And I think it's perfectly appropriate that we should be a lot more specific in the motions we make, myself included. I have not done that as much as I should. We should specify what it is specifically that we're recommending approval and how that is supported by the provisions of of our guidelines.
And I'm not against change. Change is good. I think that it would be helpful. However, I think we also need to remember that sometimes when we're making these decisions, it comes down to protection of the resource. For me, that's vitally important. And I know that things like roofs are temporary, can be replaced. Somebody gets the right money, can come in and fix it. For me, if we're going to let the rest of it rot, what's the point? So that's where I come from on some of this. I want to see the building protected. And if somebody can come in later and change that roof, I'm all for it. But if it means saving that fabric of that building, that's why I made
But the
motion.
manufacturer's literature isn't always entirely accurate about the
Not talking about the
building saving
manufacturer.
of the substitute materials you would choose.
I'm not talking about that. I mean, I do
Well,
know,
you
I
just
do know what
mentioned
those
it.
say. I read them. I went to school for this, Frank. And I know that sometimes the protection is very, very important.
Well, it's not only the protection, it is the appearance.
I agree, but I still think that protecting 90% of that building is very important. Roofs come, roofs go, and we don't know what the original roof was to start with in the shape. I'm not saying it should stay that way. I'm not saying it will be that way forever, but I'm saying we should try to protect these buildings.
The buildings have to be protected, I agree with you that far. But I don't agree to a cheaper material if
Then are you gonna
others,
give
if
the folks
all
the
the
money?
other circumstances don't support that.
Frank,
Because the appearance can be drastic.
it wasn't
I mean, we
drastic.
just approved on the last meeting that the building looks awful.
That's a matter of opinion.
Well, it doesn't look like
You are
anything-
entitled to your
That's a
opinion.
matter
I'm
of
entitled to my
opinion.
opinion. And my opinion is trying to talk about
This
this.
is a work session, so.
I don't think,
Trying to protect the building. It's done.
I don't think you have that opinion. You
Done.
shouldn't have that opinion.
Well,
That's
that's-
for approval. To change something that's historic into something that is not historic and keep it that way with its detrimental effect on the appearance of the district.
I said I wouldn't interject much, but here I go again.
Go ahead.
I think the commission has a wide range of opinions, and it should. And I don't think you're going to agree with each other or the public nearly all the time.
It's impossible.
One of the things that I gave you were the purposes of the commission. I just want to read a couple of them. Number 5 says, protecting and enhancing the attractiveness of the city to home buyers, tourists, visitors, shoppers, thereby supporting and promoting business, commerce, and industry and providing economic benefits. So I think, that falls under what Donna is talking about. Number 6 says fostering and encouraging preservation, restoration, and rehabilitation of the city's historic structures, areas, and neighborhoods. And I think that's kind of what Frank's referring to, though I think even Dr. Hoffman talked to us about this in November or December, I still can't remember the month. But there's a stark difference between preservation, restoration, and rehabilitation. And so I like the conversation.
Well,
I just want to interject that we're doing all that.
I think the purpose here is to find a middle ground between the historically accurate material replacement and the blue tarps to restore and preserve. Our job is in there in the middle to figure out which way is possible to go.
Which we eliminated blue tarps downtown, down on Main Street. That was headed, I can see it.
There we go.
So that's just, I'm not trying to fight with anybody, push my, I don't want everybody to agree with me. I'm just saying that's where I'm coming from. I want us to be able to protect these buildings. And sometimes.
Yes, and so do we all.
Sometimes.
And it's the in-between part that we work on here.
And that building was a contributing structure to downtown. I've talked to other people, they were like, oh yeah, I noticed they had a new roof. But they didn't notice the difference of the original, what was there, and the new roof. They were just like, oh yeah, we saw them putting on a new roof and changing it.
Thus, it can be changed later. It's a roof.
That's right, and now it's protected and it's not rotting because they have replaced the fascia boards and things like that. And then I know I have seen the national guidelines that kind of give a breakdown of roofing material can be a little different on historic buildings, whether it is a residential, a commercial, different types of buildings, there are a little bit more leeway if it's truly historic, contributing structures, things like that. Dr. Hoffman, are you familiar with?
No, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I'm saying that happened in this community very often on the very substantial and important historic structures because they went up with wooden roofs, nearly all of the early ones. And then steel came in, the standing seam steel roof. And that was an excellent roof. And now nearly, a high percentage of our buildings are clad in that. And I'm not proposing that we do away with it and all go back to wood. I like wood, the appearance of it, but it's expensive and it's not that durable. So we're stuck with that. It developed as a good material that was accepted. But now do we want to change everything? If you get a roof from the Bolduc house, you want to put a standing seam roof on it?
I would look at the Bolduc house as a truly historic property, and I would look at that differently than a bungalow built in the 20s.
But what we're trying to do is make the public, the national following and the national people that are supporting the whole movement, make them think the town is historic. And each motion we make should have that goal, make the town appear more historic, not to disregard the economics of it. But the purpose is to try and make it functional. And it's good, it's been good to us. Much of the improvements we have made in the town in the last, many years that I've been here, has been made strictly on the justification of the historic importance of the community.
And I understand that, but my house was built in the early 20s. There's no way that we could go back and put a slate roof on it and it hold up for more than a year or two in town with our pecan trees constantly dropping limbs on them and things. Right now we have shingles. In the future, if we ever need a roof, I would possibly consider a metal roof, just for the protection in the long run. There are a lot of buildings, like I understand, yes, we need to look at the downtown historic district as a whole, but we also should consider, I think we should consider each property individually and how it affects the town. If it's a 50s or 60s ranch home, do we really want it to look historic and fit those
Yes.
guidelines if it's in
Well,
downtown?
here in chapter
Um,
2, it's got, if the building is contributing to the character of St. Genevieve Natural Historic District, then more flexibility can be allowed. If it's a contributing, there is difference in landmark and contributing, and it, chapter 2 explains it, the French and the colonial, the federal, and it goes down. Each chapter explains the character defining features. So no two houses is alike.
Well, and, I mean, there's 5 people on the board, and we will all 5 have different opinions on how we're going to interpret our guidelines at times, you know, so it's, I mean, they're guidelines, they're not set in stone rules, but we could all interpret them differently, you
It
know.
even tells us there on the introductory.
It's on page I-1, if that's what you're looking for. You stated it in your statement. It says, "The guidelines are not a rigid set of rules, and they do not require buildings to be restored to a historical period or style. Rather, their purpose is to provide information to property owners and tenants about buildings, their distinctive characteristics, and how to maintain them."
Right.
Yes,
Because you got people
But it-
living in these houses.
but it more or less, that statement more or less says you don't continue the deterioration. You lock it in place. At the worst, you lock it in place. You don't take another step backwards.
I like the idea of, if we make a motion to give a reason why and refer to the guidelines, this will eliminate people bringing in their own preferences. It puts it right on what is allowed.
Yes.
So,
I do like the idea of having specific quotes of this request pertains to this specific ordinance. And our findings in the commission therefore are.
did you like the formats that I sent out? It was like a motion to approve/deny based on these guidelines.
Yeah.
I typically left it
But
blank
list-
there in
list
case
the
you wanted.
guideline, mention the guideline that we're referring to.
And I did. What I
Not
would-
just a number,
What I would refer to would be the guidelines that I provide you in the staff report.
right?
And then I would probably leave a blank line for any of you to insert an additional guideline if you so choose to, that maybe I didn't catch or you would like to refer to. Is that,
That sounds good to me.
So would we do it like, we're going to approve based on H10, where an historic fence exists, it should be preserved? Everything written out, worded out, that way also notes, you know, exactly what guideline we're going off of.
are you asking, should we just use the letter and number? or
Letter
the
and number
whole-
and the whole
Verbiage.
Well,
verbiage.
all of the guidelines have like H16A, B. A has a short declarative sentence. Maybe just quote that part.
Also, too, I think it would help on the presentation you give us, David,
Mhm.
list if it's French, colonial, federal, whatever it is, and then we can refer back to the guidelines to get a real clear picture before we come to the meeting.
The staff report typically lists the architectural style, but I can put it, are you asking for it in a motion
No, just in your,
in the staff report?
right,
Okay.
right. I think, to me, that would be helpful.
I'm new to the baseball game here, so just bear with me. I mean, I haven't even read these yet, and I'm an alderman, I shouldn't admit to that. I need to catch up, I need to catch up, but here's the.
It's pretty detailed.
Will you, I love the idea of you guys specifying which guidelines you're going to, regardless what you decide to do. will you also be adding in that description, if you will, whether it's contributing or historic?
That's also in the staff report, but it could be included in the.
I think it would be advantageous to your aldermen. I'm looking at it kind of selfishly from my standpoint. I think it'd be great to cite the guideline. Let us know if it's contributing or historic, and then let us know what your decision was and why, or
Well,
something.
that's usually on the application, whether it's contributing historic.
Do
or-
we see that in the alderman meeting?
I don't think any of this works its way to the alderman.
Just their recommendation.
As long as they've given a certificate of appropriateness.
It's done?
Would the alderman only see it if we deny something and it is appealed? Then do they see the whole
I would then
packet?
give them the
or-
entire staff.
Okay.
Yes. So what I'm hearing, please
Thank
let me
you.
know, is that the motion would include a reference to the specific guidelines and whether it's a contributing, non-contributing, or landmark building.
Right.
Most non-contributing, honestly, are administrative decisions, so those won't come up, but I would also like to ask that we include the specific certificate of appropriateness number in the motion. You know, that I make a motion to approve SGHC 00219, a contributing structure to the district based on H10 P4. Is that kind of what I'm hearing? But do you want the verbiage, the declarative sentences also? That could make for a long motion, but you guys get to state it.
Well, it would eliminate, I think, personal preferences if we go back to exactly what the guideline is by the number. That way it would eliminate, we all got different opinions, but it would eliminate putting your own preference in without really knowing what the guideline is saying.
Including the number and digits or
I
the
don't
entire
care.
sentence?
It don't matter to me.
Doesn't matter that part? Any other thoughts? Would you like the entire?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, I know it can get very lengthy, but I feel like maybe if we go with that for a while, then people will start to realize, oh, that fits in with my house. So when I get ready to come do a certificate, if they watched us live or watched it on YouTube, they're going to be more prepared with what is expected of them and what we're going to look at exactly. We can always go back and edit that later,
Absolutely.
correct? Okay.
Absolutely. I would also add, one of my roles is pre-work. So anyone who wants to change something can come to City Hall or call me at City Hall and we can talk about it before you even apply, just in case you don't need to apply. You know, ordinary maintenance and repair, no need to apply unless it's in-kind material being switched to more in-kind material. We ask for an attestation, but call me. Dr. Hoffman, I think Casey asked a question earlier. I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
The roofing materials for buildings, whether it's commercial, residential, are you familiar with that at all?
I mean, I think that, historically, sometimes we see different materials, based on, in a commercial downtown, those kinds of things. I think that from a guidelines perspective, that that you really are, the beginning place is what is it that you have now. That, again, they're not restoration guidelines, so it's, if you have asphalt shingles, you have a metal roof, that these guidelines aren't going to say go back with shingles. I mean, that's a level of stringency kind of beyond, I think, the intent of guidelines like these. I think also one of the Secretary of Interior standards recognizes that buildings change over time and that those replacement materials become part of the history, themselves. So if it's had a metal roof for 50 years, then that that is a historic character as well. So I think that, starting with what's there, recognizing, I think, not that roof material is not a character-defining feature, but it's less of a character-defining feature than roof shape, for example. I think I have a lot of mixed feelings about the differences in standing seam construction with the visible fasteners and those kinds of things. I think they are challenging decisions, but in evaluating the property as a whole, that thinking about, it is a similar, material, what is it that's available now, and recognizing that in terms of one of the other standards, in terms of the Secretary of Interior standards, is not making, you don't want to make changes that can't be reversed. And so when you start putting in new openings and things like that, you're dramatically changing. But a roof is by design going to be replaced, and I don't know who said it before, but that it's, if you go with that now, that's going to be changed at some point in time, and potentially it could be less visually intrusive. I think that you don't want to just ignore it and say, well, we don't care about roofs, do whatever you want, because I think, a bright, shiny, yellow, metal roof that everybody notices would detract from the district as a whole. But, so I think there are things that you should talk about and address and try to say, what is the overall impact of this alteration of the new roof?
What we have tried to do in a number of these is say when a person comes in with a deteriorated roof, be it not necessarily a wood shingle, but an asphalt shingle or some other roof, that the roof replacement be at least its equal in quality. Because there is a big distinction between what is built for machine sheds and barns and what is built to keep residential structures tight and waterproof. And I don't think we should, just because it is a metal roof, which was designed to be built on some farm building, that we should accept it in our historic district on a historic home. I think we should have a standard that says, okay, and we've done this on a number of cases. If you come in with the literature that says the manufacturer has had this tested and it is recommended for historic, or not for historic, but for residential construction, then we should give it a favorable look. Not necessarily approve, but a favorable look, not look down our nose at it. Mm-hmm. Because there are good products. Mm-hmm. But those products are slightly changed from the old standing seam. Mm-hmm. You can't find the workmen or the tools to do a good standing seam anymore.
Well, here is, David, you gave us this last year, I think. This is put out by the Department of Natural Resources. No, it's about the National Park System, about roofs.
Is that
It's not
preservation
guidelines how to do the roof. It gives you the history of what was put on at different eras. This is very good.
Is that preservation brief number 4?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
So yes.
And that, to me, that's very informative.
And that's specifically referenced in the roofing section, page 17 of the guidelines. Dr. Hoffman, I have a question. Is cost a consideration in the decision?
Cost is always a consideration. I mean, I think that that the reality is that things cost money, and I think that the cost shouldn't be the basis for a decision. And so I agree with you that the generally speaking, ordinances that are successfully enforced and will stand up in the courts will have some sort of mechanism to allow for hardship exemptions, those kinds of things. And so I think you want to take it into account, because you are, you're dealing with real people and you're dealing with their homes, and you represent, you're a public body, and so I think you need to take into account. To say that, though, isn't that you shouldn't let me come in and say, I don't really want to spend that much money. I think we would all like to spend less money on some things, so we would have more money to spend on others. And so I think you can have standards, and you can say that, this is, this is a type of roof that we're not comfortable seeing in the district, and there are these other products, and if they cost a little bit more or somewhat more, that's okay. The people need to have the opportunity to say they really can't afford it, or kind of what the alternatives are. So you have some sort of hardship exemption that they would have some justification. And I think that really you want to take into account all of the factors. And so, if it's a question of like, if I can't, I can afford to do this, and if I can't do this, then I can't do anything, and so I'm just going to tear it down and be done with it. Well, again, I think you would want to take that into account as well, because at the end of the day, you want to have these resources available, and you want to be able to have them sustained into the future. And so things like a roof, again, can be undone in the future, right? And roofs by definition will ultimately have to be replaced. Even if you put on a 100-year roof, in 100 years you're going to have to put on a new one. And so I think those kinds of decisions are consistent with the Secretary of Interior standards. But you wouldn't want to have a policy where people could come in and say, well, I want to do this because it's the cheapest, and that you feel like you have to agree to that. I think you can have some expectations of what would they need to do to prove that it's a hardship, and they should have a hardship exemption for a lower cost material.
And we do have a economic hardship section of the Heritage Commission ordinance. So I just want to clarify that.
Yeah.
And just one other word before we leave your subject to roofs, I hope. But frequently when a roof is leaking badly, it's not going to do any good to put the best roof in the world on a structure that's rotten, decayed, the wood is gone underneath. We need to be sure that what we are approving is a system. What is not complete rebuilding in many cases, if they caught it early, you can put right over the old roof. In some cases, if they haven't, and wait until they were watered out of the house, then the roof structure is probably bad. And some work on that roof structure is going to have to be part of the project. You can't just take a cheap sheet of metal and nail it on.
I think that's absolutely true. I think in terms of the mission of this body, that would then fall into the educational component of it. In other words, you're not in a position to mandate those kinds of repairs. Perhaps again, if the city feels like it is unsafe and it's a danger to people, then you have other codes. But in terms of the historic preservation ordinance, I think what you would want to do is to tell them that and to educate and to say, in order to preserve this building for the long term and to make it sustainable, you might need to do more repairs, but you couldn't force them to do that through the certificate of appropriateness process. I don't think. If I want to throw my money away, putting a roof on that should last 20 years but is only going to last 5 because I'm not addressing the underlying support.
But if it's destroying the historic structure that you're trying to protect, then you're not doing your
Can't
job.
govern that, though.
So I think that as the owner and the steward of the property, I'm not doing my job, but you as the Historic Preservation Commission are doing your job to educate me that I'm not doing my job, but to approve or disapprove a certificate of appropriateness for the work that I am requesting approval for, if that makes sense. So if I'm not requesting approval for all the work that I need, that I really should be doing, and I'm just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, you can tell me that, but you can't say, no, you can't have approval for this Band-Aid because you need much more extensive work.
But will we really know if we need all that extensive work unless it's a building we're familiar with?
Right.
Maybe, maybe not.
Well, I know that we have in the past asked the contractor doing the work if they are going, what work are they going to do to make this a worthwhile project?
I think a perfect example, we've had this, is where there is a new roof, whether it's controversial or not. We've pretty consistently asked them to please replace, I'm losing my terms here, the boards underneath, if they need to be replaced. But what you're saying is that's not what was applied for, so we're giving permission to do what they asked to do with the suggestion that you please take care.
Right, extending that to that educational mandate to say, because your mission is to promote preservation and you have different means of doing that, and one of them is educational. And so then saying, yes, it's in your best interest, in the interest of the property, if you do these other things, make sure that you're doing it right. And you have the forum to then ask the questions and ask the contractor, did you think about this? Do you think about that? We've been,
And strongly recommend.
right, but if they don't want to do it, you can't make them do
Then
it.
that's when they go to the Board of Aldermen.
I'm not, well, you have more experience in most of us than I have, but I don't see how we could say we can look the other way.
You're not looking the other way, but since you don't own it, you can't do it, and I think
Well, that's true of every instance we judge.
but you're rendering a decision on the work that they're proposing. You shouldn't withhold the decision on the work that they're proposing because you're insisting they do other work. So if my property, if I'm asking I've got some deteriorated windows and they can't be repaired, and so I want to replace them. The mortar is falling out of my bricks and it really needs to be repointed, and I come in, you can say, well, you need to replace with a wood window, and by the way, you should really repoint that or else your building's going to fall down. It's like, yeah, well, I'm not going to. I'm just going to do the windows. And you can feel badly about that, but you can't make me do that other
You
work.
can't, we cannot say you have to put in a workable roof system,
That's overreach.
because that underlying part of the roof is just as much of the system as the tin on
I
top.
think we're getting into
Yeah.
the weeds here, but
Yeah.
we do have a maintenance of historic properties section also, but I mean, I can't drive by and see what's underneath the roof, but if a chimney was falling down, I can see that, I could go to this section of ordinance and say, you need to fix that roof,
Well, there's a great deal of
or chimney.
variation in something like this, but I do think in considering them, we have to consider the roof system or the building system. Otherwise, you're not much of a preservationist.
Again, I think we are in the weeds, and I think one would hope that if somebody's investing in a new roof, that they're not going to want to install the material on deteriorated, underlayment.
It's happened here in the last few years.
But if it does, I don't think that that's something that is addressable through the certificate of appropriateness process.
I agree
Yeah,
with
but-
you.
I hadn't planned on commenting on this, but I will now make my point. You won't usually discover rotted sheeting until you take the roof off. So it's unlikely, although it may be possible to observe it. It's more likely to find it after the roof comes off. You won't granted or apparently granted a certificate of appropriateness at that point. In the 8 years that I've been attending these meetings, I don't recall anybody applying for an economic hardship. Frank, do you recall anybody doing that prior to that?
Do I recall what?
Somebody applying for a economic hardship exemption?
I don't recall anyone signing for that in the many years that I've been sitting around this.
When you read that
board.
section, it requires them to submit
Yes,
some
it
very
requires
detailed
them to make
personal
failure.
information. I'm wondering if it might be a disincentive for somebody
I
to
think it
do
would be
that.
embarrassing.
Too many.
Should we visit that?
It's very difficult. I mean, if somebody just bought a house, he may have taken that into consideration and have enough nerve to do it. But a long-time resident is very likely to come in and admit that I can't afford to fix my house.
Some of the things that you're required to submit are real estate taxes for the previous 2 years, assessed value of the property, form of ownership. So it's some private information.
Yeah.
If this, we don't have to do it tonight, but can be revisited if you want to discuss changing that a little bit or look at some other historic districts' form of economic hardship. Typically only triggered on a denial, and there haven't been a whole bunch of denials lately. But that's up to you.
But I think we better get off the roof and talk about something else. It's been a good discussion.
Okay, I'm gonna go back and start at the top of the list. So number 1, do the decisions of the Heritage Commission support the purposes defined in the city ordinance?
I mean, obviously, I've not been here, and, so if you're talking about specific decisions and those kinds of things, I can't comment on that, but I read that question, and I think by definition, the existence of the commission and its decisions supports the purposes as defined in the city ordinance.
Anyone else have opinions,
I
comments?
think it does.
Another thing, since Dr. Hoffman was talking about like changing the pitches of roofs and things, what specifically is the exterior character defining architectural features of or appearances of a building? And how would the design guidelines be used to make a criteria-based decision? When I think about that, I think of doors, windows, shapes of the roofs,
It's all in there.
porches, everything.
Siding.
It's all in there.
And the fun part about that question is that the answer is it depends. And so, and partly depends on the house, and you have and your design guidelines are very good and very comprehensive. But I think that, one of the things that I tell my students is not a single feature does a style make. So just because a particular style would have a set of character-defining features, your particular example may or may not have all of them or some of them, or your particular house might be a mix of a couple of styles. So it really kind of depends on the building itself and taking it on its own terms and asking yourself, what is it that defines the character of this building? And again, you've got some guidance in there in terms of, these are the things we look for in this particular style. But I think there's also just some more general in terms of, setbacks, pitches, scale, mass, right, fenestration.
I know that in November, December, we were limited on time and you didn't get through your entire presentation. But one of the handouts I gave you, Dr. Hoffman did cover what are the character defining features. So that's in there. I apologize the print's little, but I also emailed the presentation to each of you. Leanne?
Yes.
Did I send it to you?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't call you Elaine.
This time.
Life is looking up.
Yes, but that information is in there. And he even went through some examples of, let's look at this building. What's the character defining features? So,
I have a craftsman with an Oriole window.
And that is important on repair or whatever, is to define that character of the building. Keep it intact.
the other one I printed off is about that criteria-based decision-making. And I highlighted the part that, at least for me, if I was a commissioner, would be the tough part, and that is, it's not about what you like or don't like.
Right.
It's about making a criteria-based decision. Again, sorry for the small print.
So I know, with the mural suggestion, it was suggested to maybe, instead of doing the mural on the side of that building, add in some windows and things. To me, that would totally change the character defining architecture of that building. So I kind of look at each building as a whole, how does it fit? Because, if I wanted to cover the window at my house, that's going to change the way my house looks. But I don't know how everybody else looks at those guidelines and things like that, but I kind of...
But I would also say it depends on which elevation you're talking about. And
Sure.
so if it's a rear elevation and nobody but you and the people you invite into your yard are going to see that, then is it a character, altering, or character, is it an alteration to character define? Yes, but of such a small effect that you could probably allow that. If it was on the front, then no. And I think I was able to read what we talked about last time, which refreshed my memory. And one of the items was a property that was on a corner, and so then it had two primary elevations. So something, I guess it was a metal garage or some carport, and so it was more visible from more places, and so again, you take those into account. So it's not just the thing itself, but where is it located and how does it affect the overall?
So again, every property, different decision.
Yes.
And I'm kind of hearing something from you that character defining architectural features, depending on your opinion, can be ranked. There's some that are more
Yes.
important than others.
Yes.
So if you have to give on one to get the other, that's a decision that they could make.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is because it's in some ways, people find the Secretary of Interior, standards for rehabilitation potentially, frustrating, but they have that flexibility in there to recognize that these are not restoration properties, that they need to be adapted and changed so that people can continue to use them. And so that does mean that they are going to change. And so, yes, there certainly is a hierarchy to character-defining features. And, what is that hierarchy, you ask? Well, it depends, and it depends on the building, right?
Where it sits.
So in this comes up a lot with people doing tax credit projects. And so, and developers are notorious for not liking ambiguity, and they just want, to know what the answer is. And so when, when school buildings are being, redone, sometimes, there's a case where they were able to, to fill in part of the gymnasium, the elevated, the stage, part of it, fill that in and use it in some other way. And then a developer would then go to another smaller building and want to do the same thing. And it's like, well, no, in this building, there's so little else that gives it its character, you really need the volume of that space. It just couldn't do it. So it was the same act, but in two different buildings, having two different effects on it. So that's what makes serving on the commission so much fun, is that each decision, each building has to be taken on its own merits and on its own case that it makes.
Are you aware of any monies out there for people to repair their homes or to help with repairs according to this hierarchy thing we're discussing?
So the hierarchy thing that we're talking about is really more just to help the commission think about sort of the philosophical approach to preserving the character-defining features. I don't think you would want to tie that to then, financial incentives. Are there financial incentives out there for people to do historic rehabilitation? Not very many.
Not this week.
There are tax credits available, both federal and state historic tax credits continue to be available. I don't know how long the state will keep going, but it exists now. The nice thing about the state credits are that you can use them for your home. The federal credits are restricted to income-producing property, so they may or may not apply. Beyond that, there's really not a lot that's out there. I think some cities have tried to come up with different kinds of programs, and there are different innovative ways of trying to fund activities like this, but it becomes very challenging for cities to spend public money on private property, and so, but where there are grant programs, or if you had a community improvement district, and sometimes those funds can be used for external repairs, things like that. So communities have awning programs or facade improvement programs.
Okay.
So
I think there were different areas in St. Charles that had different
I was just trying to find ways
reimbursements
of helping
for
those who need
repairs and refurbs.
tax breaks.
And in St. Louis,
I
too.
love that.
is
And I'm
St.
thinking when they
Genevieve,
come
we
into
have
this,
money.
Right.
I'm trying to persuade them
We don't
that
have
they
money
need a
yet,
certain roof
and,
or
I
maybe say
think
this
that,
may be a
again,
tax write-off.
I live in Cape Girardeau, which is a fairly conservative community, but that it's come a long way in the last 10 years. And so there is a community improvement district now.
I'd appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
And
They've
unthinkable
done quite
I'm just
a
trying
bit
to
for the
think of ways
historic
to help.
preservation down there,
Yeah,
especially downtown.
we're trying, so, yeah.
That'd be good. Great. That'd be great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Sometimes utility companies, I don't know your relationship with utility companies, but sometimes they can provide grant money because they're interested in, having properties be occupied, business properties particularly be occupied.
So you see where I'm going with this? I mean, I don't know if it's even possible, or having a conversation where maybe there's ways of getting some type of funding and monies available. Thank you very much.
So another thing that's on our list that I wanted to run across to everyone, number 5, Should the Heritage Commission have a specific procedure for interviewing certificate of appropriateness applicants and discussing certificate of appropriateness? And should the applicants and speakers be sworn in?
I'm against the applicants and speakers being sworn in.
Yeah,
I'm
sworn
against
into
that.
what?
There's a stipulation in there that says they can be sworn in to tell the truth. But that was just a question that I,
That's kind of like that Ruth thing, you don't know if they're telling the
Right.
truth. So, yeah, no, that would
I
just
think
put them all.
one of you, I can't remember who, had shot me an email that they'd like to see each person have a moment to speak to each applicant. So I don't know if that's something you want to see or not.
This way, sometimes we sit here and we won't speak up. And this way, if you went one by one, we could give our own reason, our own thoughts of why we're like or dislike a proposal, and go down, and then we can vote.
So it would be more like an allotted time period. If someone comes and says, hey, I would like to put up a new fence in my yard, then each one of us would have a chance to say what kind of fencing, ask questions, kind of way off of this,
I
or
was
how
just
would
thinking
you?
about the board after we interview people.
Okay.
The board, I say board, I'm used to having a board, so forgive me. The commission, after we interview the people when it comes time. Or it could be, I'm open for ideas. I just thought if each person would be called on, we wouldn't all be sitting here waiting to speak up.
So you all can speak at any time, but you're saying kind of go through,
I think a lot of-
do you have anything to say?
Yeah.
And maybe like an allotted 5 minutes or something like that, and they can deny, they can say I'm all set or whatever, but they have, are you saying a set amount of time?
Would we use a set amount of time, or would it just be,
I think let us be on our honor, and if
On
it
your-
goes on and on, then you, Chair, can call them out on it.
Perhaps
I'd say
give an
5 minutes.
opportunity for questions, which we can
This way.
decline if necessary.
This way, you don't have to sit with a watch time.
I'd be happy to.
I think we have a
Well,
volunteer
sit
for
and
time.
watch.
Do you
timeless?
have a stopwatch?
I do.
Well, bring it to me.
It seems that
5
often,
minutes.
if one person brings up a question, that answers the questions of everyone else. And a round robin is not necessarily
They usually do that in the house,
necessary,
right?
but we could give a opportunity for each person.
I like that.
Well, the chairman, and I know when I've chaired, I've been deficient in this, but before we actually call for the vote, make sure that everyone has a statement from the chairman asking, has everybody had their opportunity to question?
Good, okay.
Okay, moving on. Number 6. This is kind of a touchy one. Should the design guidelines be updated? And if so, should more stringent federal guidelines be followed more closely? Or should there be separate guidelines for landmarks, contributing buildings and sites, and non-contributing buildings and sites?
I think that's addressed in chapter 2.
Yeah, we
It
pretty
is
much
Briefly,
go
yes.
that way.
Plus, there again, we're back to each building is different, each
building is-
situation is different.
Mm-hmm.
What are we trying to say? Go ahead.
That was chapter 2, right?
I mean, there are no more stringent federal guidelines
I didn't
out there
think
than
there
in
were.
terms of, I mean, there's, there are standards for restoration but that would be inappropriate, for this. So your guidelines are kind of built around that philosophical and in fact incorporate by name the Secretary of Interior standards. So those are the federal standards. And I think that that in terms of the, as Donna said, you need to take each building for what it is. And I think that if it's non-contributing, then sort of those thresholds are lower, I don't think you can write guidelines that really capture that. You would just be aware, and the goal is to not make them any more non-contributing than they are. Again, no bright
Nothing
yellow
blatant.
metal roofs, you know, kind of that would really stand out, but that you know, you would still want to use the same set of criteria about what gives this, even though it's non-contributing to the district, what gives it its character. Because, I mean, you're not going to have the time or the resources to get into, like, why is it non-contributing? Is it non-contributing because when the district was listed, how many years ago? 10 years ago, the update? 87. So if it was too young to be historic in 1987, right, it's not going to be a contributing property in the district. But if you were to redo the district today, it might fit in with, it would certainly be old enough, and perhaps it fits in with what the themes are. So you don't necessarily want to disallow a full discussion of non-contributing buildings. You would, you know, because you don't know, is it because of age, is it because of alterations? What if it was completely altered in 1987 and then some wonderful, kind-hearted, preservation-minded person bought it and took off the vinyl siding and, you know, restored the openings and put on a cedar-shaped roof, and, you know, it's still non-contributing because you haven't updated the district, but you would want to preserve its character. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that one kind of was part of one of my questions, because it had been brought to my attention that our guidelines may have kind of a gray area at times, that the Secretary of Interior would override what we have. But I know a lot of ours are based off of those standards. So-
The Secretary of Interior standards have a huge amount of gray in
They
them.
sure do.
You know, it's a philosophical set of guidelines that then has to be interpreted.
Sure.
And what your design guidelines do is interpret them kind of as appropriate to St. Genevieve at the time they were written, and, you know, so you need that flexibility.
But you did say there are no more stringent federal guidelines.
You know.
I think Bob had.
Just to comment, section 410-320 of the city code, which talks about standards for review, section 1, says in considering an application for a C of A, you should look at the substantive provisions of the design guidelines from 2001 and the U.S. Secretary of Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. And if you go to item 2 under that same city code, it said the design guidelines shall be maintained at City Hall, which they do. In the event there are conflicting substantive provisions between the design guidelines and the standards, the federal standards, as set forth herein, the stricter provisions shall apply. So you don't necessarily have to update the 2001. You should know that there's a difference between the 2001 and the standards as they're currently. I think they were just updated last year or something like that. And I think there's a small booklet that explains the changes.
It's much more likely that your local design standards are stricter
No, it's all right, man. We're
than the Secretary of Interior standards.
I'm
See
just
how you
saying,
are.
I think the question as it was originally
Right.
proposed was what happens if the
Right.
restricted.
So in that, it's if there is a discrepancy between the two, then the stricter would apply. The stricter would be the local design standards, not the federal. So there's nothing strict at the federal level, but you have the right to, like, the federal standards aren't going to say you should tell what color people can paint their door. But if you feel that's important, you could do that, and that would be stricter than the Secretary of Interior standards. And in that case, the local design standard would be what would apply. in terms of the way the ordinance is
For those of you who have
expresses
made these
that.
copies for, I apologize, I did not double sign the printout. But just to reiterate what Bob said, under 410, which is this one here, 410-320A, number 2 states, "The design guidelines shall be maintained at City Hall in the event there are conflicting substantive provisions between the design guidelines and the standards, which are this part of the ordinance. The stricter provisions shall prevail." And I think what Dr. Hoffman's saying is, for the most part, it's the local ordinances, or guidelines, I apologize, that are more strict.
Correct.
Yes, I got that too.
I think the question is, with the changes they made recently in the standards, should it be reviewed? And I think that was Kenzie's original thing. Should it be reviewed against what we're doing in our standards?
Maybe later.
I think that's what you said. I'm not.
Yeah. Yes, I know, like, one of the questions was, like, should our guidelines be updated? Because when were they done? 2001. So they're 18 years old. Do we need to tweak everything? Do a complete update? Are there just some pieces here and there that need to be updated? Maybe, maybe not.
Well, I think they're so explicit. I mean,
They are.
they are very explicit. They're ambiguous at times, but because that goes from, okay, take fence as an example. In, I don't remember what page, 62 or 3 or something, it would talk about a fence being replaced by a fence that's already there. Well, you shouldn't put a chain link fence there if you had a wire fence or a wooden fence. Then you go over to the new construction area where it talks about a fence. A new fence, you can put a chain link fence in the back, so that's the difference. You have to weigh all of this.
I don't know that it's necessarily pertinent to the kind of deep discussion that you're having about the standards or the guidelines and applying them. But I think that, moving forward and thinking about potentially, reviewing them, I mean, I think they're really very good. I mean, I think they're excellent. Which is consistent with what I said when I was here before, when I really looked at them closely. I thought they're really very excellent. Excellently done. And I'm trying to remember, I just kind of flipped through, but I'm not sure that you were thinking of mid-20th century resources when these standards were built. And so those are increasingly being threatened. And I know with the national park coming, we continue to think about the French colonial resources, which are a remarkable treasure that this community has, but history didn't stop then. And so we continue to, every age builds its own new set of historic resources. And so you might be looking for guidance on some of those mid-century ranches that
There's
are,
a few dandy ones in town.
right, and I don't recall, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're not picked up in these. And so that would be something that at some future date you might apply for a SHPO grant to kind of update and redo the design guidelines. But I think that there's none of the changes have kind of altered the basic philosophy that underpins this, that it still is, I think, solid. It's not like, oh, now it's okay to use abrasive materials or those kinds of things. None of that has really changed. It's just tinkering with the articulation of it. And so.
Yeah, I have wondered about maybe adding on something for the mid-century moderns.
How do we keep them?
Because some of them around here are quite nice.
Yeah.
And
I'll need your
rewarding.
contact information before you leave.
Okay.
You're SEMO?
Yes.
I'm alum. Does that help?
Okay.
One of them. All right, great, thank you. I'm going to ask one quick question before I forget, if it's okay. And remember, I'm new here, so nobody jump all over me. Do we have a list of contributing buildings, historic buildings, and landmarks?
Absolutely.
Okay. May I have?
Also
my hand-
available.
Oh, no, never mind then. You have it in your office? Thank you, sir. I just want to make sure. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure whose this was, but I've got a list, and I've got just all sorts of good stuff in here. I
Beauty.
could not find my
Okay.
folder from before,
I see
so I
what you're
borrowed
doing.
one, and it's just got all kinds of stuff in it. From 2015.
So another question on here is a contributing building also considered a historic building? And I know we have locally historic buildings that people want to take into consideration for things, but what really defines them as locally historic when they're not historic anywhere else? Should we look at them differently than we would look at them as just a regular contributing structure? One is the building that got the roof, people were saying that was a locally historic building, but why is that designated as a local historic building when it was a contributing structure? Did you have any more information on that one?
The landmarks were all designated via an application, again, probably from 1987 or so. Bob might know the specifics of it. But the study was done by the University of Missouri-Columbia, and it depended on several factors, from how old it was to who lived there, to what events happened there, to what style it was. I'm not sure of each individual decision, but that's what factored into it. Any further
You
contribution
can
to
look at that one until you get a copy from him.
Yeah, there are several
Thank you.
local landmarks. And when I give you those staff reports, it says landmark, that's typically a local landmark. There's, I want to say, 40, 45 structures throughout the city. Not all of them in the historic district. Some of them just outside.
I mean, if you want, I can give some technical, response. So you have designation of historic properties that occurs at the federal level through the mechanism of the National Register of Historic Places, typically, and then you can also have local designation, which occurs through the ordinance. Most of the time, in most communities in most states, those are related but separate things. And so the National Register has no, it's really an honor. If you did something to a property listed in the National Register that affected its integrity, so could no longer convey its significance, then the feds would fly in with their black historic preservation helicopters and take you off the list. I mean, that's the punishment for being bad, is you get delisted, which rarely happens. There are incentives to being to being listed in the National Register, and that's where the tax credits come in and things like that. Your ordinance, I think, you have design review for properties that are listed in the National Register. That is not is not always the case, I guess. So in Cape Girardeau, for example, that connection isn't made. I think it's a wise choice here because, again, St. Genevieve has world-class historic resources that are treasured not just to the people of St. Genevieve, but really to the people of the world. I'll even televised, I'll say that. I think it's true. I think the National Park Service has verified that, if anybody ever doubted it. I could see how it would be easy to be confused because you have design review for National Register listed properties, but then you have these other locally listed. Now, usually most communities will use similar criteria to decide what is a historic property and what isn't. And if they're determining that it is historic, then they would designate it and it would become a landmark. So if it's a contributing building to a National Register district, then it's historic. If it is individually listed in the National Register, then it is historic. If it's locally designated as a landmark or as a local district, then it's historic. If it's none of those things, but it's very, very old, then it's just old.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yes.
Thank you.
We have very few actually nationally registered listed houses. I think there's only 2 or 3 in one landmark. The Volta, it's when they established the National Historic Landmark District in 1960, everything within that district now can apply. That's why you can get historic credits for any house.
And contributing, so some of them are contributing.
You're right.
Because I think.
We don't go in and try to list on the National Register every important house here.
Well, the National Register, right, you would individually list them. If they're in a district, you don't need to. I mean, because they are, if they're contributing in a district, then that's the same status as being individually listed. And so that National Register, because I believe it was updated, because part of the issue was that very first one only focused on French resources.
I think it was like 1849, anything built before that.
Right, and it turns out like history didn't stop, and so my understanding was that it was updated at some point. I think Dr. Stepanoff was involved in that, and so then that would set out contributing and non-contributing. If it's non-contributing, then it's not historic, even if it's in the district. But you still have design review of that, and appropriately so, because again, why is it non-contributing? Well, maybe because it lost integrity, maybe because it wasn't of sufficient age to be considered when it was redone, and so you do want to have design review of those.
Or just an ugly little house.
But again, it's not about what we like or what we
I
don't
know,
like.
I know.
And
I'll get this back.
you're ugly,
Thank you,
it's
ma'am.
my beautiful.
I know.
Yeah.
More than you might think.
So another thing that was on our agenda was the Heritage Commission meeting agendas and procedures, and possibly, we kind of covered that. But I had talked with Martha briefly last week. She had maybe some ideas on changing it. Did you have anything else that you wanted to bring up, or when we?
That was my main
The
thing.
one's the main thing?
Yes. It's each one
Okay,
to be
You want to go over a
involved.
few things?
sure.
There's
So, yes, ma'am, go ahead.
There's one other thing that I've always not been comfortable with. When the people come before us for COA, it's almost like I don't like them being grilled. They're not here on trial. If we have all the information from them on their list, we should definitely ask more if we have more questions. But why do we have to keep going on through everything and grilling them what's already on their, that they have given us? To me, that's disrespectful to the people. We certainly should ask any question we have, but not grill them about what all they have said already.
So that leads me to a question that you may have already answered, and if you have, forgive me. But when you send out these agendas and these meeting notices, do you send all of the information that you were, so if your new procedure is going to be like stating H, whatever, is this what you send to them? So they can then go to their resources and review it prior to coming in?
Yes, sir.
Okay. How many days in advance do you give it to them?
Typically, if the meeting's on Monday, we get it on Thursday or Friday.
Great. So they know exactly where to refer and look. So you guys could come with your ducks in a row.
Yes.
Okay.
Mostly.
Well,
And we go look at the
we try.
houses.
An occasional goose.
The staff report would have the address, the applicant,
So
the
here's a copy of the website.
Oh, thank you.
applicable
Photographs.
guidelines, photographs, materials information, if it's going to be like a new roof or something.
Sometimes they will bring in a piece of material if we have questions about what they're going to use.
One source of confusion is when you read the staff report, you've made a recommendation, and they think it's a fait accompli.
But I don't make a recommendation.
No, you don't.
Unless it's an administrative decision, I usually put at the end this, because the different thing about, say, the Heritage Commission versus Planning and Zoning, or some other boards, in here, it specifically delineates commission review, administrative review, and I think I even gave you a copy of that. So if it falls under commission review, I don't give a recommendation, because I think as I've stated before, there, you know, I really want to get this out there. There's a plethora of backgrounds and opinions and experiences at this board, and they're not all going to agree.
Thank you, ma'am.
But it's for you all to make a group decision, and that's another reason I don't give a recommendation. Sorry. Off my soapbox.
So have we come to any decision about the COA or how it's written?
So that's what I was going to maybe finish up with, is that what I'm hearing is you would like the motions to include the specific guidelines with the verbiage at this point that could be changed later, and whether it's a contributing, you know, property or landmark property. And then I saw also added to specifically cite the application number, so that the motion is very specific. That approvals could also include further recommendations, but we can't require that of them. That perhaps in a future work session or future meeting, we should revisit economic hardship and how it's applied for, and what are the stipulations for gaining it. I can certainly look at some other historic districts and see what they do. And that one of the things I wrote down is that, you know, there are no further, more stringent rules and regulations when it comes to the historic district. What we have is a very good document that, though dated, still applies to the structures that we're looking at. The only thing that we may do is look down the road, perhaps adding something for 20th century, more mid-20th century buildings.
Well, they're coming out with such new materials now, but here again, I'm not for a lot of prefab materials to be used. It's just not the same.
But those are the things that I kind of took away as far as my administrative role in preparing an agenda and documents for you all going forward. Anything else for me?
Nope.
Just a sidebar, that I'm interested in maybe looking into some downtown renewal type
I did
things.
write that
You're a
down,
good man.
because it was just you and I didn't bring it up. But Dr. Smith brought up the possibility of, I wrote possibility of looking into help for dilapidated properties, whether that be working with the Main Street organization. There are land grant programs out there, but I was telling him those land grant programs, at least what I've looked at, are usually started by a benefactor of some sort who wants to donate a property or money and then go. There's really no city monies involved in that.
Often not, and sometimes banks will get together. I don't know if you have a redevelopment group, so.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Well, before you guys close, I just want to say, even though there is a wide field of opinions on this board,
I really appreciate the way you respected each other. You voiced your opinions, but yet you came back together, and I find that to be constructive. So thank you very much. Nothing worse than being on a destructive board.
There's no blood on the walls yet.
Right. And if there's going to be, just let me know so I can find something else to do that night. I'm kidding.
A couple nights I was up there, sure.
Does anybody have anything else?
I want to, and maybe you're going to do this, I'm sorry I'm stepping on you. I want to profusely thank Dr. Hoffman for being here. You gave us a ton of information again.
You're more than welcome. I'm always happy to come.
You poor devil.
So.
So if you get something from Gary Smith, you know who it is.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are finished for tonight. So maybe next month's meeting, David will send us out information, so.
I've had several attestations and ordinary maintenance, but no applications, so hopefully I'll see you in a month.
Right.
Thank
Thanks,
you
guys.
all very much.
Yes.